You're standing at a hotel sink in a country you've never visited. The tap water looks clear. It looks fine, but something in you hesitates before you drink it. But the real answer to why you hesitate is far stranger than simple caution. It reaches back hundreds of thousands of years into a world with no science, no germ theory, no way of knowing that invisible organisms could kill. And yet somehow, your ancestors survived long enough to become you. This is the story of how the human body learned to fear something it could not see. Start with the obvious problem. Water is everywhere and nowhere. A river might look identical from one bend to the next. One bend is safe. The other is thick with bacteria from a decaying carcass upstream. There's no color difference, no obvious smell. Most of the time, nothing that announces danger the way a growling predator does. Your ancestors face this problem every single day for their entire lives, without exception, unlike food, which can be inspected, smelled, and tested in small bites. Water is often gulped quickly, out of urgency, out of thirst, that can become dangerous within hours. So how did they survive this invisible gamble generation after generation for hundreds of thousands of years? The answer isn't a single trick, it's a layered system. Some of it is built into your senses. Some of it is built into your gut, and a surprising amount of it isn't biological at all. It's cultural, passed down the way stories are passed down. Quietly saving lives without anyone fully understanding why. Begin with taste and smell, because this is where the story usually starts. Your tongue and nose are not just pleasure organs. They are ancient detection systems, tuned by evolution to flag danger before it reaches your bloodstream. Bitterness, in particular, plays a starring role here. Bitterness is a taste that, throughout most of evolutionary history, correlated strongly with toxins and with the biological waste products released by certain bacteria and decaying organic matter. Researcher Paul Breslin, a sensory biologist who has spent decades studying taste perception, has shown that humans are exceptionally sensitive to bitter compounds compared to other tastes. It takes only a tiny concentration of a bitter substance for your tongue to detect it and trigger an automatic response, grimacing, or the urge to spit. This isn't a personality quirk, it's a survival circuit. Bitterness detection likely evolved specifically because plants and spoiled substances that could poison you often carried bitter chemical signatures. Water contaminated by certain algae, decomposing material, or specific bacterial colonies can carry faint bitter or off notes too, especially compared to clean spring water. But taste alone couldn't have been enough. Why? Because many of the deadliest waterborne pathogens, like the bacteria that cause cholera or dysentery, are essentially tasteless and odorless in the concentrations that make people sick. A person could drink lethally contaminated water and detect nothing wrong at all, right up until the illness began. So taste was a partial shield, a useful one, but not a complete answer. This is where smell takes over some of the work, particularly a very specific, very old psychological reaction: disgust. Disgust researcher Valerie Curtis, a public health scientist who spent much of her career studying hygiene behavior, proposed that disgust functions as what she called a behavioral immune system. The idea is straightforward once you hear it. Your body has an internal immune system that fights pathogens after they've already entered you. But disgust acts as an external immune system, one that stops pathogens from entering you in the first place by making you recoil from things that are statistically likely to carry disease. Stagnant water, water with visible scum, water near feces or rotting matter, water with an unusual smell. All of these trigger disgust responses that are shockingly consistent across cultures worldwide, according to Curtis's research spanning dozens of countries and communities. Doesn't it seem strange that gross is actually a survival calculation running quietly in the background of your mind? Curtis and her collaborators found that disgust responses to contamination cues appear early in childhood and show remarkable similarity across vastly different societies, suggesting the reaction isn't purely learned from parents. It seems to have a deep evolutionary foundation, likely shaped over an enormous span of time as a defense specifically against disease transmission through contaminated water, food, and waste. So your ancestors weren't reasoning through microbiology. They were reacting, recoiling, feeling something was off, long before anyone understood what bacteria even were. But senses and instinct powerful as they are, still leave enormous gaps, which means something else had to be filling those gaps. Here's where the story becomes less about biology and more about behavior passed between generations. Anthropologists studying traditional societies have found consistent patterns in how communities selected water sources, long before modern sanitation science existed. Moving water was preferred over still water. Water from higher elevations closer to a source was preferred over water further downstream where more contamination could accumulate. Water near animal trails or dense vegetation was often avoided. None of these choices required understanding bacteria. They only required pattern recognition passed down as practical wisdom. This spring has always made people sick. Avoid it. Or this stream near the reeds tends to be safe. Use it. This is cultural transmission acting as a survival tool, operating completely independently of formal scientific knowledge. A child raised in a community simply absorbed which water sources were good and which were bad, the same way they absorbed which plants were edible and which were poisonous, through observation, warning, and repetition. In many hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies, water source knowledge was treated with something close to reverence. Certain springs held ritual or spiritual significance, often the exact springs that happened to be clean, fast-moving, and free of upstream contamination. Some researchers studying indigenous ecological knowledge suggest these spiritual designations may have functioned, whether intentionally or not, as long-term memory systems encoding practical safety information into cultural and religious practice so it wouldn't be forgotten across generations. Isn't it remarkable that a belief system could function as an accidental public health system? Now here comes the counterintuitive twist. The part that reshapes how you should think about all of this. For a long time, it was assumed that early humans largely failed at water safety. That waterborne illness was simply a constant, brutal fact of ancient life, killing indiscriminately with little humans could do about it. And to a real extent, that's true. Diseases like dysentery almost certainly killed enormous numbers of ancient people, and childhood mortality from contaminated water was devastating throughout most of human history. But researchers studying the human gut have found something that complicates the simple story of human vulnerability. Studies of the human microbiome, the vast ecosystem of bacteria living inside your digestive tract, suggest that populations with long histories of exposure to certain regional water sources developed somewhat adapted gut flora, better equipped to tolerate specific local pathogens than a complete outsider's gut would be. This is part of why travelers today sometimes experience traveler's diarrhea when visiting a new region, despite the water being perfectly safe for locals who grew up drinking it. The water isn't inherently more dangerous. The visiting gut simply lacks the tolerance built by lifelong local exposure. This means your ancestors weren't purely at the mercy of an unpredictable environment. Their bodies were, in a slow, generational sense, adapting to it. Not perfectly, not completely, but partially through repeated exposure across a lifetime, and potentially through mechanisms passed to offspring as well. This reframes the whole question, doesn't it? It wasn't only about knowing which water was safe, it was about becoming compatible with the water you grew up around. There's a deeper layer to this too, one connected to something far more familiar to you, fear itself. Psychologist Mark Schaller, who has studied what he also calls the behavioral immune system, found that disease avoidance psychology doesn't just shape individual choices like which water to drink. It shapes entire social structures. Communities historically dealing with high pathogen exposure often developed stronger norms around outsiders, stricter rules about cleanliness, and more rigid cultural taboos. In other words, some of the earliest social rules in human history, rules about purity, cleanliness, and who is welcome to share your water or your camp, may trace back to disease avoidance as much as to any spiritual or political motive. Keeping your water source protected from outsiders wasn't just about resources. It may have quietly protected the group from unfamiliar pathogens as well. Layer by layer, a picture forms. Bitter taste sensitivity flagged some danger. Disgust responses flagged others. Cultural transmission preserved hard-won lessons across generations. Localized gut adaptation offered a slow biological buffer. And social norms around purity may have added yet another protective layer, all without a single ancestor ever seeing a bacterium or understanding germ theory. It wasn't one solution. It was an overlapping, imperfect, remarkably effective system, built entirely without conscious scientific understanding. Now bring this back to the present moment, back to that hotel sink, back to that instinctive hesitation before drinking unfamiliar water. That hesitation is not irrational. It's not simply modern anxiety or overcautious travel advice lodged in your memory. It is an echo of something ancient, something written into your senses and your instincts long before science could explain why it mattered. When you smell water and something about it feels off, that's disgust doing exactly what it evolved to do. When you instinctively distrust stagnant water over a flowing stream, that's a pattern etched by countless generations who learned the same lesson the hard way. When your stomach reacts poorly to water in a new country, that's not weakness. That's the simple, honest limit of localized adaptation. The same limit your ancestors would have faced moving into unfamiliar territory. Modern science eventually caught up to what instinct and culture had been managing imperfectly for millennia. In the mid-1800s, physician John Snow famously traced a cholera outbreak in London to a single contaminated water pump, one of the first rigorous demonstrations that disease could travel through water itself rather than through bad air, as most people believed at the time. It was a turning point. For the first time, humanity had a scientific explanation for a danger the body had already been quietly defending against for hundreds of thousands of years. Germ theory, filtration, and chlorination didn't invent water safety. They finally explained it and then dramatically improved upon what instinct and tradition had already been attempting with far less precision for an almost unimaginable stretch of time. So the next time you glance at a glass of water and something in you pauses, even for a fraction of a second, remember what that pause actually represents. It isn't paranoia. It isn't overthinking. It's inheritance. A quiet, wordless warning system passed down through an unbroken line of ancestors who survived exactly because they learned to listen to it. You're standing at a hotel sink in a country you've never visited. The tap water looks clear. It looks fine. And now you understand exactly why some ancient, careful part of you still isn't so sure.